Punk rock should mean freedom, liking and accepting anything that you like, playing whatever you want, as sloppy as you want, as long as it's good and it has passion. Kurt Cobain. The beginnings of punk rock have always been heavily debated, but when the fast-paced, three-chord, straight-to-the-point New York band The Ramones came onto the scene, everyone knew what punk music was. You can hear this energy and rawness in so many bands that spawned after the Ramones. Bands and artists ranging from the Pixies to Slayer to David Bowie have all pulled elements of punk rock into their music. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how punk rock influenced three different genres of music: post-punk, thrash metal, and grunge. Punk rock reshaped the way that music was made and has had an everlasting influence on musicians for over 40 years. Take a look at this slide. Shortly after the explosion of punk rock in the late 1970s, a slew of weirdos across the UK felt that it was possible to play music the way that they wanted to. The DIY ethic of punk rock shot straight into the hearts of struggling musicians across Great Britain. Bands like Joy Division, Gang of Four, and Public Image Limited found the inspiration that they needed to pick up their guitars. According to Theo Katforis's 2001 book, Are We Not New Wave?, the term post-punk was first used by journalists to describe groups moving beyond punk's sonic template into disparate areas. When you listen to the multitude of post-punk albums of the late 1970s to the 80s, you hear the distinct sound of something different, something that punk rock had introduced to the world. You hear the wailing of Ian Curtis's voice on Warsaw. You hear the shrieking guitar of Gang of Four. You hear the attitude and belief that rock music had gone back to its roots. At the same time that post-punk began to dig its claws into the foundations of music for decades to come, a new brand of punk rock began to emerge: hardcore punk. Hardcore punk hit like a sonic bomb. It was like the Sex Pistols turned up to 1,000. Everything was faster, louder, and much more aggressive. It was during this time that metal had become a shell of its former self. Hair metal, or as I like to call it, butt rock, was what metal had become. According to Joel McIver's 2010 article, A History of Thrash Metal, this genre evolved from combining the drum beats of hardcore punk with the guitar styles of the new wave of British heavy metal. Bands like Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth, also known as the Big Four, were hugely influenced by punk rock. Dave Lombardo, formerly of Slayer, said, "The fusion of heavy metal and punk took over Slayer's early mediocre style. Hence, a new force was born." Metal had become unattainable and watered down. Poppy metal was the antithesis of what Black Sabbath had created. It was time for metal to change. It was this perfect combination of speed and melody that gave birth to possibly the greatest metal bands of all time. At the peak of thrash metal, punk rock had taken a nosedive into obscurity. As the golden era of punk rock began to crumble in the late 1980s, former punk rockers and punk rock enthusiasts began to form their own bands. Bands like Nirvana, the Melvins, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, and a multitude of others owed their unique sound to the punk rock movement. According to Stephen Felix Jaeger's 2017 book, With God on Our Side, Towards a Transformational Theology of Rock and Roll, he states, grunge was deeper and darker sounding than punk rock, and it decreased the adrenaline-fueled tempo of punk to a slow, sludgy speed. The Seattle grunge scene was a mix of punk rockers and metalheads that went to shows together, unlike many other scenes. With this beautiful combination of genres came the raw and simplistic sounds of grunge music, which opened the doors for many other underground bands to make their way to the forefront of 90s rock. Punk rock made this happen. It paved the way for struggling musicians to chase their music despite their unappealing sound. Punk rock was the voice of a generation. It perfectly encapsulated everything that was missing from rock and roll. Punk music influenced musicians from all walks of life and all backgrounds to play music the way that they wanted to. The ethos of punk rock has carried on from generation to generation and has completely changed the face of music forever. From post-punk to thrash metal to grunge, all these genres would not have existed without punk rock. Punk rock isn't something you grow out of. Punk rock is an attitude, and the essence of that attitude is give us some truth. Joe Strummer.